Welcome to part 2 of our two-part series on the Mundell-Fleming model. In part 1, we set the stage. We met Mundell and Fleming, introduced the concept of a small open economy, recalled the structure of ISLM, added the world interest rate R* as a horizontal line, and surveyed the capital mobility spectrum. We saw that under perfect capital mobility, fiscal and monetary policy have dramatically different effects depending on whether the exchange rate is floating or fixed. We met the Impossible Trinity. Now, in part 2, we go in the opposite direction. We dive into the case that Mundell and Fleming originally studied most deeply, the small open economy without capital mobility. We will work through the diagram step by step, and we will see exactly how fiscal and monetary policy operate when the capital account is closed. Why does the no capital mobility case matter today? 3 reasons. First, many economies, particularly emerging markets and several historically important developed economies, live through long periods of closed capital accounts. Israel before 1998, China for most of its history, India until the 1990s, and many others. Understanding their macroeconomics requires this framework. Second, even today, the no capital mobility case is a useful baseline for understanding the more general open economy model. By studying the extreme case where capital flows are completely absent, we isolate the effects of trade alone. Third, many countries facing balance of payments crises have temporarily closed their capital accounts. Argentina, Russia, Greece have all done this. The no mobility model tells us what to expect during such episodes. So let's start with the basic structure. Under no capital mobility, the ISLM diagram looks exactly the same as in the closed economy. We have the IS curve sloping downward, the LM curve sloping upward, and they intersect at a domestic equilibrium with output Y0 and domestic interest rate RD. The world interest rate R* is drawn on the diagram as a horizontal line, but it does not bind anything. There is no capital flow that would equate RD with R*. The domestic interest rate is whatever the domestic ISLM intersection sets it at. R* is informational, not constraining. This is a critical insight. In a closed capital account small open economy, the central bank has full control over the money supply, exactly as in a closed economy. The government has full control over fiscal policy, exactly as in a closed economy. Domestic interest rates are determined purely by domestic supply and demand for money. The trade account is still open. Goods can be imported and exported, but the financial isolation means that the rate of interest does not need to clear any international market. Now here's the catch. Even though we can have any domestic interest rate, the open trade account creates a different constraint. The country's net exports depend on the real exchange rate. The real exchange rate, in turn, depends partly on the nominal exchange rate and partly on relative prices. If output changes, net exports change. If the exchange rate changes, net exports change. And imports are linked to domestic income. So the IS curve in an open economy with closed capital account looks slightly different from the closed economy IS curve. It incorporates the effect of net exports on aggregate demand. We can write it as Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, where NX is net exports. This open economy IS curve still slopes downward in the interest rate, but the slope is generally a little less steep because changes in the interest rate have a smaller effect on aggregate demand. In the closed CA case, that's the main modification we need to make. The LM curve is the same as in the closed economy. Money market equilibrium depends only on domestic interest rates and domestic output. There are no international monetary linkages because the capital account is closed. Now let's analyze fiscal policy. The government announces a fiscal expansion, let's say increased government spending by an amount delta G. This shifts the IS curve to the right by an amount equal to delta G times the closed economy multiplier, 1/1 minus the marginal propensity to consume out of disposable income, with the qualification that imports represent a leakage from the multiplier. What happens to the new equilibrium? The IS prime curve intersects the unchanged LM curve at a new point. Both output and the domestic interest rate are higher. The output increase is significant. The interest rate increase reflects the additional money demand at the higher output level. There is no capital outflow because the capital account is closed. There is no exchange rate appreciation because there is no capital flow that would push it that way. The full multiplier effect plays out in the domestic economy. The result is striking. Fiscal policy is very effective under no capital mobility. The expansion doesn't get diluted by capital flows. The crowd out is limited to the standard closed economy interest rate-induced fall in private investment, not the additional crowd out from currency appreciation that we see under perfect mobility and a floating exchange rate. But there is a subtle issue. The higher output raises imports, while the exchange rate has not changed. So the trade balance deteriorates. If the fiscal expansion is sustained, the country runs persistent trade deficits. Without capital mobility, those deficits must be paid for somehow. The country could draw down foreign reserves, or it could be forced to devalue the currency, which would shift the IS curve through a different channel. So in the long run, fiscal expansion under no capital mobility has trade balance implications that the simple short-run analysis doesn't capture. But in the short run, fiscal policy is powerful. Now consider monetary policy. The central bank expands the money supply. The LM curve shifts to the right. The new LM prime intersects the unchanged IS at a new point. Output is higher. The domestic interest rate is lower. There is no capital outflow because the capital account is closed, and so no exchange rate depreciation from this channel. Monetary expansion succeeds in lowering interest rates and raising output, exactly as in a closed economy. But once again, there is a subtle issue. The higher output raises imports, while the lower interest rate may also discourage saving in domestic financial assets. The trade balance deteriorates, and the country may face downward pressure on the exchange rate over time through the trade channel rather than the capital channel. If the exchange rate is fixed, the central bank may have to draw down reserves to defend it. This brings us to a critical distinction. Under no capital mobility, the exchange rate is determined entirely by trade flows, not by capital flows. If the country is on a floating exchange rate, the rate moves to balance the trade account, to equalize the value of exports and imports. If the country is on a fixed exchange rate, the central bank uses reserves to absorb trade imbalances. Either way, the exchange rate plays a different role than in the open CA case. Under a fixed exchange rate, fiscal expansion in a closed CA economy produces a trade deficit. The central bank must sell reserves to defend the fixed rate. The longer the fiscal expansion is sustained, the more reserves are lost. Eventually, reserves run out and the fixed rate becomes indefensible. This is the classic Krugman first-generation balance of payments crisis model, and it relies heavily on the closed CA assumption. Under a floating exchange rate, fiscal expansion in a closed CA economy depreciates the currency through the trade channel. The depreciation makes exports cheaper and imports more expensive. Net exports recover. The IS curve, having shifted right from the fiscal stimulus, doesn't get shifted back much because the depreciation actually shifts it further right through net exports. Floating exchange rates absorb fiscal shocks, rather amplifying them under no capital mobility. These results contrast sharply with the perfect capital mobility case from Part 1. There, floating rates made fiscal policy weak. Here, floating rates make fiscal policy potentially even more powerful. The shift in regime from no mobility to perfect mobility completely reverses the policy implications. This is one of the cleanest demonstrations of the importance of the financial structure for macroeconomic policy. Let's think about what this means historically. In the post-war Bretton Woods era, capital mobility was deliberately restricted. Most countries operated essentially as closed capital account economies, even though they trade. Under that regime, both fiscal and monetary policy worked well as stabilization tools. Governments around the world used Keynesian demand management with apparent success. The unraveling of Bretton Woods in 1971 and the gradual liberalization of capital accounts in the following decades fundamentally changed what policymakers could do. Mundell-Fleming explains this transformation. Today, only a few countries operate fully closed capital accounts. China is the most prominent example. India has gradually opened. Most emerging markets have capital accounts that are open to long-term flows but restricted on short-term flows. The fully closed case is rare in the modern world, but it remains the appropriate model for important historical episodes and for crisis periods. Now let me work through a numerical example to make these abstractions concrete. Imagine a small open economy with no capital mobility. Initial output is 100 billion. Initial domestic interest rate is 5%. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.7 after netting out import leakages. The simple multiplier is therefore 1 over 1 minus 0.7, which is 3.3. The government announces a fiscal expansion of 3 billion. The IS curve shifts right by 3 billion times the multiplier, about 10 billion. Without LM constraint, output would rise to 110 billion. But the LM curve constrains us. As output rises, money demand rises, the interest rate rises, and investment falls. The new equilibrium ends up somewhere around 107 billion, with the interest rate now at maybe 6.5%. The multiplier is approximately 2.3, less than the simple multiplier of 3.3 because of the interest rate crowd-out. Compare this with the same fiscal expansion in a closed CA economy with a floating exchange rate. The fiscal expansion raises Y. The trade balance turns negative. The currency depreciates. Net exports rise. The IS curve shifts further right. The new equilibrium has Y around 110 billion or higher. The depreciation amplifies the fiscal stimulus. Or compare with a perfect capital mobility, floating rate economy. There, the fiscal expansion is almost completely neutralized. The IS shifts right. The interest rate rises, capital floods in, the currency appreciates, net exports collapse, IS shifts back. Y barely moves. The same 3 billion of fiscal stimulus produces almost no output growth. The same policy. 3 different financial structures. 3 completely different outcomes. This is the essence of why Mundell-Fleming is one of the most important models in macroeconomics. It tells policymakers that you cannot evaluate fiscal policy in isolation. You have to know the capital mobility regime and the exchange rate regime. They jointly determine what fiscal policy actually does. The same logic applies to monetary policy in the no capital mobility case. Monetary expansion is fully effective. Lower interest rates raise investment. Higher output raises consumption and imports. The trade balance deteriorates. Under fixed rates, reserves fall. Under floating rates, the currency depreciates, which amplifies the monetary stimulus. So we have a clear picture. Under no capital mobility, both fiscal and monetary policy can independently affect output. Both are effective. The exchange rate regime matters for the second-round trade balance dynamics, but not for the first-round ISLM impact. This is why countries with closed capital accounts have so much policy flexibility, and why they have to be careful about losing reserves or accumulating trade deficits. There is one more subtle but important point. The Mundell-Fleming model with no capital mobility is essentially a static, short-run model. Over longer horizons, persistent trade imbalances must be resolved. Persistent inflation differentials must be reflected somehow. The model is a snapshot, not a movie. To analyze longer-run dynamics, you need to add the price-level adjustment mechanism, typically through a Phillips curve or an aggregate supply equation. But for short-run policy analysis, Mundell-Fleming is the workhorse. So let's summarize what we've covered across both parts of this series. Mundell-Fleming extends ISLM to the open economy by adding the world interest rate R* and the capital mobility assumption. Under perfect capital mobility with floating exchange rates, monetary policy is powerful and fiscal policy is weak. Under perfect capital mobility with fixed exchange rates, the reverse holds. Fiscal policy is powerful and monetary policy is impotent. Under no capital mobility, both policies are effective, but the trade balance dynamics become the binding constraint. The exchange rate regime always matters, but in different ways depending on capital mobility. The deepest lesson is the Impossible Trinity. A country cannot simultaneously have a fixed exchange rate, open capital flows, and independent monetary policy. It can have any 2 of these 3, but not all 3. Every country in history has had to face this constraint. The choices each country makes about which 2 of the 3 to keep are what produce the diversity of macroeconomic outcomes we observe globally. Mundell-Fleming is more than 60 years old. The world has changed enormously since the 1960s. Capital is now massively more mobile than it was. Financial markets are deeper and faster. But the basic insights of the model remain valid. Every modern open economy macro textbook builds on this foundation. Every central bank analyzes its policy options through this lens. Every IMF program is designed with these trade-offs in mind. If you have followed both episodes of this series, you now understand more about open economy macroeconomics than the vast majority of professional economists who haven't studied this framework formally. Please share these videos with anyone who wants a clear, visual introduction to how exchange rates, capital flows, and macroeconomic policy interact. And subscribe to Macroeconomics with Michael for more deep dives into the foundational ideas of modern economics. Thank you for watching.